Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those joining us from Israel and other places. Very happy today to have two really thoughtful guests who are going to share with us about a very important issue. We have with us today Dr. Jed Siev, who's a associate professor of psychology at Swarthmore College, as well as somebody who has specialized in the area of OCD treatment, specifically related to OCD and religious scrupulosity, and is currently in the process of publishing a book for clinicians to help clinicians learn about how to best treat OCD connected to religious scrupulosity. We also have together with us today Nachum Goldstein, who living in Israel in Gush Etzion is a student at Yeshivat Har Etzion, and who has written recently for our blog at Refuat Hanefesh about his experiences with OCD and religious scrupulosity. And we're always particularly grateful when people who themselves have experienced mental health illness or mental health challenges are willing to share about those openly. Such an important part of our goal of breaking the stigma and realizing that these are things that we should all feel comfortable talking about, because they are part and parcel of the human experience that so many of us have. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention for the audience that the three of us are not strangers to one another. We're connected in various ways, going back to Jed and my childhood, long before Nachum's childhood, but together with his mother and aunts and uncles. So we know each other from way back. So it's good to be together and to be connecting with old friends about such an important topic. Okay, so to get us started, Jed, if you could give us a little bit of background just about the whole concept of religious scrupulosity and OCD, and to help us understand about how these things come together. Why is there specifically a connection between religion and OCD? Is it are religious people more prone to obsessive compulsive disorder? Does obsessive compulsive disorder play out differently in religious people than it does in people who are not religious? Anything particular to the Jewish community or the Orthodox Jewish community related to how OCD plays out?
Okay, yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. It's really a pleasure to be here. There's a lot in that question, so I'm going to try to be succinct. Start off by just making sure everybody's on the same page about what OCD is. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, as you can tell from the name, is a disorder characterized by obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that the person experiences as distressing. Usually distressing means something along the lines of anxiety or fear. Sometimes there can be other emotions involved, like disgust. But intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that cause, for the sake of this discussion, let's say anxiety. And then compulsions, aka rituals, so I may slip back and forth between those terms, are things that the person feels compelled to do, often repetitively or in a rigid way. And they can be actually sort of thought-related covert compulsions or overt. So they can be behaviors. You may think about things like hand washing as rituals or compulsions, but they can also be canceling thoughts, trying to replace quote unquote bad thoughts with good thoughts. And the key is that they're done in an effort either to neutralize the obsessions or undo them in some way or prevent some feared consequence from them. So there's a pretty direct relationship between obsessions and compulsions. The obsessions lead to the anxiety, and the compulsions are efforts to try to get rid of the anxiety or reduce it in some sort of way, but they can also be mental compulsions. Now, scrupulosity is a manifestation of all of that, in which the obsessional themes, the obsessional core fears are religious or moral. So it may look very similar sort of topographically to other types of OCD, like let's say contamination-related OCD, but the obsessional fears have something to do with, say, ritual contamination, like Hilchos Nida would be a common one. Or they may be pretty different. But scrupulosity is just a version of what I described with OCD that's manifest in those domains with those sorts of fears. You also asked about whether religious people are more prone to OCD, and actually the data are quite clear that they're not. OCD, however, is opportunistic, so to speak, and latches on to areas of importance to a person. You're not very likely to get stuck obsessing or having obsessional fears about things that don't have personal meaning or relevance to you. Maybe there's some exceptions to that, but at least painting with broad strokes. And so people who are very religious, and in fact, cultures and subcultures that tend to be very religious, we see very high rates of scrupulosity among those who have OCD. However, the data are fairly clear that not only is there no evidence, but there's some evidence against the idea that being more religious is a vulnerability factor in terms of the likelihood to develop OCD. If you weren't religious and you have OCD, it's quite likely that you would instead have a different manifestation of OCD, but not that you would not have OCD.
Okay, so one of the things that I've heard about religion and OCD is that while religion might not cause OCD, that sometimes it can be a little bit trickier to recognize in oneself or in others that the OCD is present, because some of the behaviors that somebody with OCD is engaging in when they are religiously scrupulous activities are things which are kind of culturally normative within their group. So if I could just turn to Nachum for a minute and ask you to walk us through a little bit, how were you able to recognize at a certain point that some of the things I know you described in your blog that you were experiencing, seemed like normal religious kinds of thoughts and patterns to you? How were you able to discern at a certain point that they weren't just the kinds of religious thoughts and patterns that everybody around you was having?
First of all, Jed Open, thank you so much for having me in for this incredible opportunity. We really, really appreciate it. And like you mentioned, for me, it was more a matter of thoughts as opposed to actions. Like hand washing was mentioned, for me, it was more in the category of obsessive thoughts and I guess feelings as a result of those thoughts. I guess the trigger for me was, I always know let's take Tshuva, for example, going to that area. So come Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur time. So obviously there's a sense of, Imat Hadin and the sense of trepidation, like approaching Yemei Hadin. But, at a certain point, I realized that I was probably experiencing a bit too much. Then this is probably not what Chazal had in mind, what the Bali Musar had in mind. I can't sort of pinpoint exactly, what it was, but just something felt off. And I mentioned in my blog, my father's a rabbi, my mother's a psychiatrist, so I had two very good people to turn to, and they sort of set me straight in saying, listen, tshuva is great, and guilt has its place, and all those things, but Dirac Darchei Noam is a guiding principle, and how you're supposed to live your life as a Torah observant Jew. And again, that doesn't mean it's easy. It just means that there's it's not supposed to result in this overwhelming feeling of anxiety and guilt, and that you can't function. I think that's the key. Once it starts interfering with your day-to-day functioning, be it actual activities or stam, just being totally wrapped up with these thoughts, and you can't do anything else. So for me, that was the indicator.
Okay, and thank you for sharing that. And I just want to take a moment to translate. You mentioned the guiding principle of Dirac Darchei Noam, the idea that the ways of Torah observance should be pleasant, right? Is a principle, and you're saying that certainly in a lot of ways it became unpleasant and causing a lot of difficult and challenging thoughts, leading to feelings which interrupted your functioning. Certainly can understand how at that point there was a recognition that this wasn't what religion was asking for. I guess a question I would have for both of you, but I just want to pause for a second to mention that if anyone who's watching has a question, you have two options for leaving a question, which we can then ask to either Nachum, Jed, or both. Either on the Facebook Live, you can put your question in a comment. But if you would prefer for your question to be anonymous so that others can't see that you're asking it, you can email that question to info@refuathanefesh.org. Either way, I will get the questions and do my best to convey them. So the question that I have is that, some of the things that Orthodox Jews experience in their upbringing, their religious messaging, etc., doesn't sound so pleasant, right? Like, spend 2 weeks, cleaning every part of your house with a toothbrush before Pesach every single year, right? Or, no matter how tired you are, make sure that you get out of bed in order to be able to finish saying Kriya Shema before 9:17 and 32 seconds, and 10 halakim or whatever it is, right? Those can seem like pretty tense, anxiety-producing types of instructions. So, I'm interested in hearing how educators, rabbis, and maybe we ourselves talking to ourselves can think about those kinds of strict religious demands in ways that won't feel like anxiety triggers for people, particularly those who have, an anxiety-related disorder. If I'm understanding correctly, OCD is within the guidelines of a anxiety-related disorder. But for all people who, have difficulty managing anxiety, regardless of whether it's to a disorder degree. So, Jed, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to start. So a couple of things come to mind as you ask that question, and one is that your examples I actually think are point in two different directions. So if you spend 2 weeks cleaning everything with a toothbrush for Pesach, you're doing Pesach cleaning wrong. So actually that sounds to me like an example of the religion being corrupted a little bit in the interest of either perfection or certainty in some way or something. Like you don't have to use a toothbrush to clean your house to prepare for Pesach. So if you'd like to, then maybe that would be different. But I think that more generally, Nachum, I'd be curious whether or not you would agree with this, since I'm sort of piggybacking on what you had just said. It's not that it always has to feel good. I don't think that's the alternative to it feeling oppressive all the time either. And if you don't mind me just reading something for a moment, this is a short passage written by Grünwald, who was somebody who was very close with the Stipler and wrote the Eitzos V'Hadrachos of the Stipler. And although he doesn't call it OCD by name in this particular little passage, it's very telling. It's clearly he's referring to OCD. He says, if a person with these obsessional concerns goes and asks the opinion of a teacher of the law, so he goes to ask a shaila, the reply given will not calm him, since he will continue to have many doubts that the authority asked did not hear properly, did not understand his question sufficiently, or even if he did hear, did not understand this specific picture in all its details, since he himself had not explained it adequately, and there's no end to these doubts. And therefore, in order to avoid the fear of doubt, he is stringent with himself and repeats the act again. And so it continues, God forbid, every time getting harder and more distressing. Now, here's the core part. Ordinarily, a person may occasionally find himself in a situation where it is difficult to carry out a commandment, so he cannot perform it with his usual appropriate pleasure, for this is the nature of man. He sees this as a challenge, and on the next occasion will carry it out with pleasure, since he usually performs commandments with enthusiasm and pleasure. However, the person who, whenever he performs the will of the Creator, finds his soul and his energies contorted by feelings of discomfort, fear, tension, and misery over the carrying out of the commandment, and on the contrary, this is his usual state, and to carry out commandments out of joy is the exception, this then is clear proof that this was not God's intention. So it's not that every time you're really tired and have to make Zman Kriya Shema, there's some contradiction, like you should never have challenges. Nothing should ever be hard. It should all just feel like a big party. Then nobody thinks it should all feel like a party. There's a lot of work. It's avodas Hashem. But if the dominant experience, if the driving force behind it is fear, anxiety, tension, misery, you're doing it wrong. Doesn't mean you never have a difficult moment. You never don't have a taiva. You never don't want to do something. It's never hard for you. I think it's talking more about your overall experience and motivation in general. So that's at least one factor. I'll be quiet for a moment and see what Nachum has to say.
No, I agree 100%, and thank you for that clarification. Obviously, my intention wasn't to say that everything's great, everything's wonderful and easy, and like that. Obviously, that's not the case. And like you said, it's avodat Hashem, and there's work involved, and there's a lot of things that have to be done, and there's a way to do them, and this is how you do it, and dafka this way, not that way. That is all very, very true. But like you mentioned, if the overall experience of an Oved Hashem is that of tension and misery, and I guess if you want to put it this way, if the Malkeinu is overpowering and the Avinu isn't so present, so maybe that's a sign that something is time to recalibrate a little bit and see what exactly is going on. Because again, obviously it's challenging. In fact, there's a great chapter in the Alei Shor, where Shlomo Valva, he wrote the Sefer Alei Shor. And in there he talks about Yemei Ha'ava v'Yemei Hasinah, the days of love and the days of hate. Basically, everyone goes through slumps, like towards the end of baseball season now. It's people go through slumps. It's totally like a good hitter hits 300 and doesn't hit 1,000. It's impossible, But like, and even then, meaning you can't have perfect days all the time, and it's just not going to happen. You're going to go through ups and downs, and that's totally fine. But again, if someone like takes a step back and sees his life, like what is my life like as a Jew, and it's just torture. I don't think that's it doesn't have to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way.
And one last thing to tack on, I love the Dirac Darchei Noam as one sort of way to capture that. When folks get stuck in some of the details a little bit more, another sort of idea from Chazal that I think does speak to these sorts of things as well is that it's lo nitna lamalachei asharis. There's no standard by which, and it's applied lahalacha. There's no standard where there's an expectation that a typical person couldn't be expected to hold to. And so if you are experiencing something in a way that is, we can throw in other things, right? There's lots of these mechanisms in halacha, but if your experience of certain requirements is one that a normal person can't be omed by, then you're doing it wrong also.
Okay, I want to come back to a number of things that you guys have mentioned, particularly in terms of, how to distinguish between a normal, healthy level of stress around difficult things and, that overwhelming, sense, right? So I think at the extremes, we could definitely distinguish between them, right? But as you get towards the middle, how do you distinguish between it and when and how somebody should decide, whether to look for intervention or help. And the other part of it is the messaging, as a religious community around some of these things that, we do have, messaging like you're sharing about the ways of the Torah should be pleasant or that the Torah, is not meant to be executed perfectly by people all the time. And we also have messaging, which is very common, like telling stories about, people who have excelled in sort of superhuman, unusual ways, or, talking about, fear of sinning being a motivating factor and things like that, which are also common, religious tropes, and how to, how can, again, I would say educators, rabbis, parents, and ourselves to ourselves, kind of pick among those messages and balance them. So that's just food for thought, but I want to share a viewer question with you first. Kobe Greenfield asked, does exposure therapy work for someone with scrupulosity, and how would it work? What would one do? And I'm not sure whether Kobe is referring to this, but I would add in, if you have a religious therapist with a religious client, right, exposure therapy might typically look like having somebody purposefully do something or not do something, right? How can that kind of work in a religious context without telling somebody, let's say, to, sin or to miss out on an obligation or something like that. Yeah, Jed, I guess if you could share with us about that.
Yeah, so the answer is that the first line treatment for OCD is something called exposure and response prevention. It's sort of a focused, tailored form of cognitive behavior therapy. And yeah, that's also the first line treatment for scrupulosity, and it can be done, no question. I'm understanding from the point sort of, well, but how would you do it? And the way you explain that the person asking the question is sort of wondering, well, you would just be told to then do things that are usur. And no, that would be doing it wrong as well. So you'd have to find things that the person experiences as violating their OCD without actually violating religion. And sometimes this requires collaboration with a Rav, let's say. And it's a little bit of a paradigm shift, because I think that we probably normally approach, Rabbanim certainly probably approach things usually as like staying clear of problems, right? How many times is there's a machlokas and we try to satisfy all the opinions, or you're not sure if you made a neder, and so somebody says do hataras nadarim or something like that. That's fine for people in general, but that would be problematic for somebody with OCD. And so the paradigm shift is looking for ways to get as close as possible to the edge, let's say, of what is allowed without crossing over that, so that you can violate the OCD and not the religion. Now, if a person has no obsessional concerns that extend beyond the actual letter of the law with halacha, then I'd suggest they're probably struggling with religion, and that's not OCD. Otherwise, there's going to be something a little bit beyond. So what does that actually mean? Practically speaking, it means something different for everybody, depending on what their obsessional fears are. But for example, I've done things working with people who, let's say, had kashrus was a focus of their obsessional fears. And so we end up doing things like, I don't know, touching cheese and then without washing our hands, going and handling meat to cook and that sort of things. And when we got close to things that there were genuine shilas about, we clarified exactly how far we could go with a Rav. How far can we go without crossing over? And so I just want to more broadly say that really that is analogous to all sorts of OCD treatment. If I had a patient who had fears about stepping on a contaminated needle in the street, and so they'll never wear sandals outside, they always wear steel-toed boots or something, what are we going to do as an exposure? Are we going to go outside and say, well, we have to learn how to tolerate uncertainty, so let's go find dirty needles and stick ourselves with them because you can't be sure? That's insane. Of course not. What you're going to do, though, is you're going to walk around with sandals outside, or maybe even barefoot outside, and you're going to accept the possibility that doing so may lead to this terrible outcome. But it's a normal, acceptable behavior. I think most people would be willing to do it. And so we're going to do it accepting the risk that it might lead to something that would be very bad, but it's a risk that one is allowed to accept, so to speak. And that's what we're trying to do here as well. We're not going to say, well, you're worried about basar v'chalav, so let's go eat a cheeseburger. No, that's like sticking yourself with a needle by analogy. But you might say, let's do things that are not usur to do, that your OCD, though, tells you or is prohibited or is not being careful enough or something like that, recognizing that in so doing, we are increasing the risk by some amount, but it's mutter to do so. Happy to field follow-up questions, but that's sort of a broad characterization.
I'll just plug in reference to what you just said in terms of a paradigm shift for rabbis, that, one rabbi who's really working on helping other rabbis engage in this paradigm shift is Rabbi Yoni Rosensweig. He's written a lot about this, and he's in the process of trying to put together a rabbinic training program for rabbis to, work with clinicians and understand how to respond to questions specifically for a population dealing with various mental health issues. And, shameless Refuat Hanefesh plug. He also has a great blog post on our page, which is a chapter from his upcoming book that's still not out yet due to publication issues. I'm sure it's something to do with supply chain in China or something like that, like everything else nowadays. But, so one of the few places you can read an actual chapter of his book yet is on our website. And he also participated together with Dr. Shmuel Harris, who is his co-author, on one of these live conversations. And you can go to our live conversation page and watch the video of that after this one is over. But that is a paradigm shift. And I do think that there are a number of rabbis who are really becoming more attuned to, working together with people's therapists to answer these. Yes, I'm sorry.
Just one little tack on is just, once we're talking about those sorts of things, if it makes it sort of more relatable or more palatable, you can think about the way the Rambam talks about working on things in Hilchos Deos. If you have too much of a certain midah or too much of something, there's an overcorrection. And so really fundamentally, you can think of exposure as working that sort of way. You're way too far, you're out of the normal spectrum in one direction. And so we're going to spend some time on the edge of the normal spectrum in the other direction without crossing over into something that would be too far, like sticking ourselves with dirty needles or like actually doing things that are also to do. We're going to spend time on the other side so that you can recorrect to the middle and find your place in the normal healthy spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Nachum, let me ask you the following, going back to that issue of, some of the messaging, right? So there's, definitely sometimes when, in the type of religious upbringing, which I'm assuming that you had, knowing the schools you've been to, et cetera, where there's, messaging that, is not purposefully anxiety producing, but is pretty intense. In terms of either, as I said, I'll give an example from the yeshiva that you're in, right? Is that, they tell the story about Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zatzal. I assume it's true that after Tisha B'Av, on Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to eat. And on Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to learn Torah, right? So that as soon as the fast was over, before he would go to eat, he would sit down and learn because he missed, learning Torah, more than he missed eating, right? You could imagine somebody, hearing that story and feeling an intense amount of pressure and guilt about being hungry and going to eat, right? Which is not probably what Rav Aaron Lichtenstein would have wanted from that. So I'm wondering whether there are, messages that you heard which contributed, to that kind of feeling, and ways that you would think about, well, maybe if this message could have been packaged differently or shared in a different way, it might have been less, anxiety triggering.
Absolutely. There's actually another story that often gets mentioned when I think Rav Aaron, this was a notice that was posted on what's called the thermostat. It's actually in Corona, it wasn't there, now it's back. Basically, the way it works in Har Etzion, in the back of the Beis Medrash, there's like basically a notice board. I don't know the whole story behind it, but it's called thermostat. In any case,
yeah.
Rav Aaron once came to Shir and he told the story of Michael Jordan in Game 6 of the '97 NBA Finals, and he had a very high fever, but he played anyway. And the message was like, even if you're not feeling well, if you have a headache, you should still come. If he could do it, you could do it. And obviously, it's a great story and it's great motivation. But like you said, that can sort of give someone the impression that, okay, like I'm in bed and I can't move, but Michael Jordan played and Rav Aaron did it, so now I have to do it. And obviously that's not something that I'm sure Rav Aaron would want. And I would think that's the situation that any mechanech would want for his Talmud. So that's one example of that message sort of coming across in the wrong way. And another issue that I would like to raise, and something that I think we all have to be very careful with, like especially people who are more inclined sort of taking those messages and applying it in that way, would be Gdolim biographies. And that's something that I think we have to be very careful with. Obviously, there are books that are super inspiring, and all of them are, like these are tremendous tzaddikim. But again, sometimes the messages that they're packaged in a certain way that creates this unrealistic expectation. Something that I found very helpful in dealing with that. There are two main sources that come to mind, but there are plenty more. But one, we mentioned Rav Lichtenstein. One of Rav Lichtenstein's rebbeim was Rav Hutner, and Rav Hutner writes in Negros Uksavim, he writes a letter to one of his Talmidim, and the Talmud's basically he's explaining his situation. He feels that he's not doing well enough, and he's struggling in his with Hashem, and he's asking Rav Hunter for help. So Rav Hunter says that, and he actually talks specifically about what we just mentioned in the Gedolim biographies. He said, we're told all these stories. He mentions the Chafetz Chaim. We hear the Chafetz Chaim never spoke Lashon Hara, and it was perfect. But he said, like, you can't imagine the amount of times that he did speak Lashon Hara, and he did have a hard time, and he did struggle with that. Eventually, he became the Chafetz Chaim, but no one tells the first part of the story, which was how much he struggled. We only know the finished product, which is the Chafetz Chaim and all the Svarim and all that. But no one ever tells us about how he became the Chafetz Chaim. He wasn't born like that. Straight out for Meir Torsky, he once said, the Chafetz Chaim didn't come out of, he wasn't born, like this. In case the midwives were saying something that he shouldn't be hearing. It doesn't work like that. So, and again, this is Rav Hunter, Rav Lichtenstein's Rabbi, who's saying this to the Talmud. So that's just something that really, really helped me sort of keep a proper perspective. And another one, the Rambam, like Jen mentioned, Hilchos Deos, at the end of the third parak in Hilchos Deos, he says that part of Avodas Hashem is eating when you're supposed to eat, and sleeping, and like doing all those day-to-day things. And dafkan, if you're not feeling well, then you have to take care of yourself. So if you're in bed and you can't move, so according to the Rambam, you should take care of yourself, and you shouldn't, feel guilty that you're not going to the base medrash and learning. Those are just two examples, but I think in general, like, it's true that sometimes there's an impression that there's this, unrealistic expectation that you're supposed to go above and beyond what's humanly possible. But in reality, I think the Torah's outlook is that, if you're not feeling well, you should take care of yourself. And in general, you should just be in a state of mind that will optimize your functioning and not harbor your functioning.
Right.
And more generally, I think it's also true just more generally in society that there are public health messages that are good for the public, but aren't necessarily good for all individuals in the public. So messaging about, avoiding eating certain kinds of foods and being mindful of calorie intake and that sort of thing, that stuff I'm sure serves a public health good in general. But of course, somebody with an eating disorder can latch onto those messages in a very unhealthy way. When I used to work at Mass General Hospital, every single room in the hospital had to have including rooms where there was just research happening, let's say, had to have bottles of Calstat, which was their brand of Purell, and all of our ID tags had the message clean hands, good health on it. And I'm sitting there working in the OCD clinic, right? So these are good messages, I'm sure, in a hospital, but for any one individual, they can latch onto it in a way that's unhealthy. And that's true of Sifrei Musar and Musar Shmuzin and Gedolim stories and a lot of these things, that when people can take them as aspirational, they can be inspiring and they can help you try to aspire toward some of those sorts of things. And if somebody doesn't take it that way for whatever the reasons are that either predispose them to that or the way the message is conveyed, then of course it can become a toxic message, at least for certain individuals.
Okay, yeah, that's quite complex, because we need to be able to, I'll say this, right? There's a lot of pushback that one sees currently, which I think is important, right? To, avoid saying things that, can trigger one person or another, right? For all kinds of reasons. And I think that the empathetic impulse to say, what would this message sound or feel like to somebody who X, Y, or Z is a very, loving and caring impulse. The challenge is, so what can we say? How can we talk about things if, there's such a spectrum of different people with different challenges that almost anything you say could kind of be, something as simple as sanitize your hands could really be a difficult challenge is a difficult challenge for certain people. And when we think about that religiously, right, I think that challenge is there, right? How can we say this is really important without running the risk of it being latched onto by somebody for whom that's not the right message that they need to hear at a specific time? Okay, we'll leave that as a challenge. I don't know. It's something for food for thought. But I do want to go back to this question of sort of the line between healthy and unhealthy ways of thinking about these things. And, sometimes I think that people conceptualize that, OCD just being an example, right? That there are people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, and then there's everybody else. And, we were talking before, and I'd be interested in hearing, you, Jed, expound on this clinically, and Nachum, if you could talk about this in terms of, your peers and other people you knew in yeshiva who maybe were never diagnosed with OCD, how there can be, plenty of space in the middle where there are, unhealthy compulsions or unhealthy obsessions, in the mind of somebody who is not now nor never will be diagnosed with OCD per se.
I missed the first part of the question. There was a bit of a lag in the connection. Can you just repeat the first part?
Okay. Yeah, that often, in people's minds, there's somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder and somebody who doesn't have obsessive compulsive disorder, and that's a stark contrast. And Jed and I were talking before about how, there's really more of a space in between where people who are not diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder still might be having obsessive thoughts, compulsive behaviors, unhealthy or unhelpful anxieties or reactions to anxiety. So I wanted Jed to reflect upon that clinically, and if you could reflect upon, whether, you saw within your yeshiva life people who, weren't necessarily diagnosed with OCD, but, ways in which, some of that anxiety and the reaction to it came out in unhealthy ways for other people.
Yeah, so the one important thing to clarify in general, this isn't just true of OCD or the various sort of ways of thinking or emotional things that are often part of the OCD experience. Really, it's true of everything in psychology and psychiatry, even things that you might imagine would be exceptions, that they're all dimensional. They're not really categorical. We talk about them as if they're categorical. We adopt this sort of medical model. This is a disorder. If you have, 5 out of 9 of the following symptoms, it's a thing, as if it's really a thing. And as I once had a mentor who sort of quipped about this and said, look, we talk about this, if you're familiar with this expression, like we're trying to carve nature at its joints. But what if we're really dealing with meatloaf and not turkey? And it's true. There's no this, like we can do a test, positive or negative, COVID, HIV, pregnancy, OCD. Of course not. It's on a dimension, and there's never going to be a point at which we say, well, this is totally fine, and this now has become totally not fine. As you said, you can recognize it maybe at extremes, that sort of thing. And so functional impairment becomes really the most important consideration. If you're thinking about, you said how to decide when to look for help, that sort of question. It's about functional impairment. People with religious scrupulosity, certainly people who are members of religions that have sort of stood the test of time. Certainly Judaism would be one. This works for most people. Most people don't get stuck in these ways. It may be fertile ground for people to get stuck, but obviously most people are able, who want to be observant without it becoming too functionally impairing. And that's really when it crosses over. What counts as too functionally impairing? That's subjective to some extent. But it's also worth recognizing, as we talk about OCD, that in just understanding how OCD itself works, it might have been tempting to say, well, people with OCD, they have weird thoughts, right? They have these doubts, and other people don't really have those doubts. And, they might be sitting there chopping vegetables, and their kid comes into the room and they get the thought, like, what if I just run this knife right through my kid's stomach? But other people don't have those weird thoughts. The data are very clear that just about everybody has thoughts. And not only does everybody have strange, intrusive thoughts, but you can't even distinguish between people with and without OCD's intrusive thoughts on the basis of the content. They're no weirder on average. They're no stranger. They're no more anything in people who have OCD than in people who don't. They're more frequent. They're more distressing. And that's really more about how people are relating to those thoughts. Right? Are they treating it sort of like neural noise, like whatever? I don't know. I just had a strange thought. I'm not really sure what that means. And they move on. Or are they getting stuck? Well, what does this really mean that I'm not this? Does this really mean that about me? Does it mean I'll do it? Does it mean I want to do it? What kind of a person would even have such a like those sorts of things? And so at the end of the day, everybody experiences intrusive thoughts. People lie on some sort of dimension in terms of all of these different struggles, characteristics, traits, experiences, etc. And it's a problem for you if it's a problem for you. And if it works for you, that's okay. And so there's a lot of subjectivity. And some of it goes back to what we were discussing earlier as well about what's driving it. What motivates it. Sometimes you can benchmark against other people. Are you the only guy in the yeshiva who misses half a second Seder because you're still davening mincha and you can't get yourself to stop? That might be a sign, etc. I'm going to be quiet and let Nachum weigh in on this as well.
So again, like you mentioned, I would definitely say that, at least from my own personal experience, that the line is definitely, is this interfering with my day-to-day functioning? Having said that, as was also mentioned, there definitely is a spectrum, and I could say from my own experience, obviously, yeshiva can be a very intense place, as you would imagine. And like, so I'm just thinking, especially around Elul time. And I guess if you want to put it this way, there are people who, you see them like clapping al chait, and you think to yourself, like, is it really that bad? Like, whatever they did that's causing them to just like completely like lose it and break down. And of course, obviously, there are people that they dominance very genuine and 100%, but there are people and there are cases where you see like in high school, let's say you see a 16, 17-year-old just like sobbing uncontrollably in a way that comes across as okay, like something might be a bit off here. And there are all sorts of signs. And again, even if it's not, even if he's functioning and he's fine, but there's some things that could be in a conversation with him, or he may say something that you might ask yourself, okay, like it doesn't have to necessarily be seen that way. There are all sorts of like little things, even if it's not a clinical issue per se. But I mean, there are a few people that come to mind just to go over the course of my years in yeshiva, where either things they've said or attitudes that that they've sort of had, like comments that they'd say like in passing, just like little things like that. And again, it's not a clinical issue sometimes, but it does show a certain perspective or thought pattern that they may have, which it could eventually, hopefully won't, but it could lead potentially to, if it's on a more constant basis, turning into something a bit more on the clinical side of things, as opposed to just a certain perspective on religion or on whatever the issue may be. But it's definitely prevalent and a lot more than people think. Like I've spoken to friends who they've been struggling with whatever the issue may be in yeshiva, and they'll say things like, oh, like it's so nice to know that I'm not the only one. And I feel like saying, like, the amount of people, like, if you look around, like the chances that someone in yeshiva is not going through something is very, very low. And that's not to say that everyone is being treated for OCD or clinical depression, like that's not what I'm saying, but everybody struggles with these things, everybody without exception, to a certain degree. But the feeling that like I'm the only one going through this, and, it's only me and I'm the problem, it's just not true.
Right, and I'll just add another shameless Refuat Hanefesh plug here, a program which we ran in May, which Nachum was a part of a video for, which is how we first came to hear about Nachum's experiences, and then encourage him to write a blog and take part in this conversation. We ran a program for students going to study in yeshiva or seminary, particularly because there's a lot of developmental reasons and life circumstance reasons of big life changes, etc. Why that's just a time in life when people are in late adolescence, going away from home, trying something completely new, etc., etc., etc. Where and Jed, you can contradict me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm not wrong. Is that the studies about freshmen in college, bear out some of the exact same kinds of things, that just developmentally and all of those things. This is a time when a lot of people are going to go through internal struggles, trying to figure themselves out in a lot of way. And it would be, in my view, extremely helpful and healthy if there was a significant amount of normalizing of that on the front end, right? Not wait, some, times we're very good at, when somebody comes and has a difficulty, helping them find the help that they need. and that sometimes the normalization on the front end of, hey, this is going to be a year when it's likely that you're going to have an amazing time, learn lots of things, grow in really exciting ways, and struggle in some of these kinds of ways, like many people do. That can make a big difference. So yeah, I think that, you're probably right, Nachum, that almost everybody is struggling in some way in those environments, because those are just times of life and types of environments which are struggle inducing, like, all kinds of, changing jobs or becoming an empty nester or whatever. There are certain times in life which are ripe for, causing, certain kinds of emotional struggle. Yeah. So I just also wanted to comment on, one thing in terms of, kind of determining, when this is clinical or not clinical, or, where on the spectrum of disruption of, functioning one is. Something that I encounter a lot when I, work with students, is that, people will say something along the lines of, I'm having a really difficult time with this, but it's not to that level. So I shouldn't really, it's almost feeling like I don't deserve to reach out for help because I'm not, quote unquote, sick enough. And, while I think that, that sort of, looking at is functioning being disrupted or not as that benchmark, I would almost advocate for the benchmark meeting. If you feel like you would benefit from getting some help, so reach out and get some help. You don't have to justify it to yourself that, well, my functioning is sufficiently disrupted that I deserve to reach out for help. Anyway, that's happy
If
to.
I could just add to that.
No, please.
Meaning, I think a proper way to look at this would be just like any other. If someone has a headache or whatever the issue may be, you don't necessarily have, like, I don't think anyone who's experiencing leg pain would say, okay, like, as long as I could still, like, if I could walk and I don't need crutches, then I won't check this out. Like, if you put it in that frame of reference, so yeah, if something's bothering you, then okay, then you could just see what needs to be done to solve the issue. People go to doctors even if they're not, deathly ill. You go to the doctor, if you're not feeling, they go to the doctor. Like, it's just a normal process of, okay, like, I noticed that something's off. What could be done to fix the situation? I was just thinking to a friend the other day, and like something I've been thinking for a while. Like, if I were writing Pirkei Avos, which I didn't, but if I did, like, aseh lecha rav, aseh lecha psicholog, meaning it's just someone to have, in over the course of life, someone to check in with. Just like you go for checkups for all sorts of things, and I don't think mental health should be any different. Sometimes you just need a checkup to see if anything's off, even if it's not so dramatic. But that's definitely something to take into account.
Yeah, I agree with what you both said. And at the same time, another competing sort of interest is that we want people, if you're thinking about from the perspective of, say, an educator, a rabbi, that sort of thing, you want people also to be practiced in tolerating discomfort. That's a skill in life as well. And so those things all can come together. They may sound like they're opposed, like you don't have to have a disorder to go get help. But also it's okay to feel uncomfortable and that sort of thing. And the way I think that message could be communicated a little better, let's say to students, if you're thinking from the perspective of educators, to just community members, if you're thinking from the perspective of clergy, is you don't want to teach people implicitly or explicitly that they shouldn't have doubts, that they shouldn't have certain feelings, that they shouldn't feel uncertain, they shouldn't, or messaging about, say, perfectionism. It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to feel however you feel. It's okay to have uncertainty about all kinds of things, religious and otherwise. And tolerating those things is something that will be helpful. Being able to tolerate uncertainty. Intolerance of uncertainty is one of the very big sort of cognitive processes, like ways of thinking, that sets people up for a lot of anxiety, both generalized anxiety and OCD as well. And so it's, you get help whenever you need help. Doesn't matter if you meet criteria for something. And also it's okay to just have discomfort and live with that, or to not be sure. And and to not be comfortable and to not be certain. Chasing certainty at a literal sense is going to be an impossible task. You're chasing your tail and just making yourself feel worse and worse and get more anxious and more anxious. And so it could be modeled a little better, probably. It could be communicated a little more clearly and explicit schmoozing and whatever. I think, like Nachum was saying, like there's so many more people in the base measures around you if you're in yeshiva who are struggling with something, maybe even something similar to what you are, than you realize. And so that's a little bit of the stigma that, Refuat Hanefesh, for example, is working so hard to bust. This sense that you're not supposed to wonder certain things or feel certain ways. Who says? You know how many other people probably are? And maybe they can relate to it a little better. Maybe somebody with OCD or with other vulnerabilities, it gets a little more stuck, or they have more difficulty relating to it in a way that is tolerable or healthy or something. But the fundamental experience is going to be there for lots of people. So let's just be honest about it.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that sometimes it drives even a little bit more deeply in our culture. I don't know exactly which aspect of our culture, drives some of this. Is that just, sort of the very notion of even acknowledging to oneself, but certainly verbally, of having a complex emotional life, right? The sort of the typical, the answer everybody always gives to how you're doing is fine, right? And that's, how rarely that's the answer, right? Sure, if I'm averaging out my days over the last 100 days, yes, I'm fine. But, right now, how you doing? Oh, I'm really excited, or, a little bit sad or whatever, but it doesn't dawn on anyone to say those things because there's something uncomfortable, even kind of acknowledging that emotions exist, which just makes it more difficult to talk about some of these things. Okay, so we're rounding out close to an hour, and wanted to try and bring a little bit to a close our discussion together. I think that there are a lot of examples that we have all probably seen of people who are religious within our religious community, for whom religion is playing a role in some of the things that aren't going well in their lives. And sometimes that gives us pause about whether it's the shidduch scene and encouraging eating disorders, or whatever those kinds of things are. And I think that you framed it early on in an important way, in saying that it's not the religion that's causing those things, but it's rather that if what matters to you in your life is your religious community, so the way that certain kinds of disordered thinking is going to come out is around those things. So I just was hoping we could each of you could sort of end with a little bit of what would be your most important takeaway for somebody who is balancing internally or with somebody in their lives. Is religion something which is interacting with them positively? Is it something which is causing or part of a negativity? What's the most important thing for them to know, to take away, to in terms of an action item that they could really take with them to try and help them sort that through? Either one of you can go first.
I mean, as a psychologist who treats a lot of folks who have OCD, I think, I'm not positive this captures all aspects of your question, but the most important takeaway from me to anybody out there who is struggling with this or has a loved one who is that you can treat this within your value system. This does not, doing effective treatment for scrupulosity is not going to force you to make a choice between your religious values and beliefs on the one hand and your mental health on the other hand. And I actually appreciate that question from earlier that sort of wondered about that, because it is a mistake that I see in my field a lot. And And it's an unfortunate message that people get, sometimes accurately, because there are treatment providers who may push that sort of thing and not understand it. But the idea is to be able to disentangle your religious experience. We use the word rituals in religion also, by the way, your religious experience from your OCD experience, so that you can live a life that's not in service of anxiety reduction, but is in service of whatever's important to you, which may be your service to Hashem or religion. And you can learn the skills to be able to disentangle those and to live a fully committed from life, if that's what you want to live. Cutting out the part that has latched on, sort of glommed onto it, and is masquerading as religion, but is really not. And you do not have to choose between these. They are not opposites. You can do it effectively with the most effective first line treatments. And if you've gone to somebody and it seemed otherwise, you need to find somebody else, because they're not doing culturally sensitive, certainly, or probably even effective treatment. There's no reason that you have to either abandon what's important to you or sacrifice your mental health for it.
Just sort of echo what Jed said. So yeah, like for me, just the notion, when I was like able to actually like internalize this, it was a total game changer for me. But just the notion that it is possible for, you know, halacha to be hijacked, quote unquote, by you know, by these thoughts, behaviors, whatever it is, you know, just masquerading as we spoke about earlier before I went live. Like if someone, you know, has an issue and he's constantly, you know, washing his hands before eating, and all and any suffix he might have, like that's the classic example. But halacha is very clear on what constitutes a suffix, what's not a suffix, and things of that nature. So the system can be hijacked by these thoughts and compulsion. Just knowing that's a possibility, that what I'm doing it is not what halacha requires, or is not you know, proper avodat Hashem in its proper context. That was very liberating for me, because it just gave me the freedom to know that, okay, just because I'm feeling something, I'm feeling a religious thought or a religious feeling, it's really not. You know, there's a word that I heard that you know, that they think of often in this context. And it's the Baal Shem Tov. He said that we say every night at Marav, "Vaser Satan lefanenu me'acharim." So I actually forgot which one's lefanenu, which one's acharim. But being that there's a Satan sort of in front of us and a Satan behind us. Again, I forgot which one's which, but you know, there's one type of Satan which says, you know, eat pork and, you know, speak lashon hara and like do all those things which we know to be asur, and that's very easy to confront. But the Satan sometimes will tell us, you know, you should feel guilty in a place where you're not supposed to feel guilty, or you should feel excessively guilty about, you know, X and Y. And going back to Greenwald, you mentioned this earlier, who had the exchange with the stipler. I actually have it right here. Eitzos Adrachos, highly recommended. Required reading, if I may say. Some people say such a thing. But he actually mentions that those types of thoughts, he says, you know, explicitly, they're atzat hayetzer, those types of excessive guilt, anxiety, all those things, and that's not how Avodat Hashem should be. And like we said in the beginning, it doesn't mean that, you know, it's happy-go-lucky and everything's great and, you know, everything's easy. That's not the case. And of course, you know, there's work, and it could be you know, difficult and annoying sometimes, etc. But it doesn't mean that the general, you know, feeling should be one of overwhelming guilt and just, you know, paralysis and not being able to do anything.
Right. Okay. And I'll just, you know, close by saying that, you know, and let's make sure that itself doesn't become its own, you know, obsession. You know, oh, I'm obsessing about whether I'm feeling too guilty, right? Anything can fall into that pattern. And one of the keys is to allow yourself to have the emotions that you're having, and to, you know, recognize that sometimes those emotions are wonderful and beautiful, and sometimes they're difficult and they're challenging, and that, you know, you can have all of those emotions and work through them. And sometimes you can work through them through some pain tolerance, and sometimes you can work through them with the help of a friend, and sometimes you need to work through them with the help of a professional who's going to help you work through them. And all of those things are completely, you know, normal experiences within the, you know, the continuum of human life. And we should all support each other and help each other in being able to do that. So with that, I really want to thank both of you. You know, Jed has dedicated his life's work to helping people who are going through various emotional struggles and putting a particular lens on some of the kinds of ways in which those struggles come out in our community is, tremendously helpful to have somebody from within the community, focusing that energy on helping us understand how those dynamics work out, and helping other clinicians through his writing understand how to treat members of our community effectively with research-based methods is a tremendous service to our entire community. And, Nachum really, breaking ground on, being able to, talk publicly about these kinds of things with just a tremendous amount of, comfort and goodwill about, things which, as we all know, unnecessarily, sometimes people find, very difficult to talk about publicly. So thank you both tremendously for sharing with us, and, hope everybody out there learned a lot, and will continue to have amazing opportunities to learn and think through these complex, emotional human things together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.